A face 4,000 years old, reddish hair, a felt cap, wool woven in a pattern like tartan, buried in a desert in western China. For 100 years, that could only mean one thing. It was wrong. These are the Tarim mummies, hundreds of bodies dried whole by the salt in the air of the Taklamakan Desert. To a modern eye, some look unmistakably Western, and for decades the explanation was exactly what it looked like. Europeans, somehow, impossibly far from home. In 2021, scientists finally read their genomes. The answer was stranger than the myth. They were not strangers from the West. They were strangers to everyone. The Tarim Basin sits in the Xinjiang region of northwest China, ringed by mountains, filled by one of the driest deserts on Earth. That desert is why the mummies exist. They were never embalmed. The salt and the aridity simply dried the bodies before they could decay, naturally completely for thousands of years. The earliest securely studied burials date to roughly 2100 to 1700 BC. Later ones continue down into the first millennium AD. This is not one people in one moment. It is a place that kept its dead for 2,000 years. The strangest site is a cemetery called Shaohe. Small river. The dead were laid in boat-shaped wooden coffins, each marked by a tall oar-shaped post, wrapped in woolen cloaks and felt caps. A boat graveyard in the middle of a desert with no sea. The bodies have names now. The Beauty of Lulan, found in 1980 by Chinese archaeologists near the dried lake of Lop Nur. A woman who died in her 40s, roughly 3,800 years ago. Church and man, many centuries later, in the first millennium BC, tall, reddish-haired, in a red tunic and woolen leggings woven in a plaid. Beside him, an infant, with a blue and red felt cap and small stones laid over the eyes. They do not look like what you expect from Bronze Age China, and for 100 years that look drove the entire story. The clothes were the first clue. The textile archaeologist Elizabeth Wayland Barber studied the Tarim cloth and found genuine twill and plaid weaving. Sophisticated loom work that, technically, resembled Bronze Age textiles from Central and Northern Europe. The features, the wool, the weave, it all pointed the same way, west. The scholar most associated with that reading is the sinologist Victor Mayer, who first saw the mummies in a museum in Urumqi in 1988 and could hardly believe they were real. In the year 2000, Mayer and the archaeologist J.P. Mallory laid out the case in a book, The Tarim Mummies, that these were Indo-European people, perhaps the ancestors of speakers of Tocharian, a lost language later attested in exactly this region, who had migrated in from the Western Steppe. The people archaeologists call the Afanasyevo. It was a coherent story. The bodies, the cloth, the language, a migration, all of it tied together. But Barber herself drew a careful line. Cloth is not blood, and neither is language. People, she cautioned, can change the language they speak without changing anything in their bodies at all. That caution turned out to matter more than anyone realized. Because the one thing the Western story had never been tested against was the DNA. In October 2021, a large international team published in the journal Nature the first genome-wide ancient DNA ever recovered from these people. They sequenced 13 of the earliest Tarim individuals from around 2100 to 1700 BC. The result did not match the story. These were not migrants from the Western Steppe. They carried no detectable Western Steppe ancestry at all. None of the Afanasyevo signature, none of the Bactria Margiana farming civilization signal the migration theories required. They were overwhelmingly something far older. About 72% of their ancestry came from a population geneticists call the Ancient North Eurasians, an Ice Age lineage best represented by a single individual who lived in Siberia some 17,000 years ago. The rest, about 28%, came from ancient Northeast Asians. The Ancient North Eurasians are almost everywhere else a ghost. They left fragments in many later peoples, then vanished as a distinct population. In the Tarim Basin, 4,000 years ago, they were still there, and barely mixed. The authors stated it plainly. Their results do not support the previous hypotheses, not the Afanasyevo migration, not the Tocharian pastoralist origin, not the farming civilization route. The mummies had not come from the West. They had been there more or less alone for a very long time. Here is the part that makes it strange rather than simple. The same study looked at a second group, from the Tocharian Basin, the next basin north, just over the mountains. Those people from around 3000 to 2800 BC did carry heavy steppe ancestry. Afanasyevo, the very migrants the old theory was looking for. So the steppe people were right there, one basin away, and the Tarim population still shows solely local ancestry. The migrants were on the doorstep and did not get in, because isolated did not mean primitive. From the very founding of the population, they were dairy herders. The proteins of cattle, sheep, and goat milk were trapped in the tartar on their teeth. They grew wheat and millet, crops not native to the region, and irrigated the desert to do it. They had taken the entire toolkit of the Bronze Age world around them. The animals, the crops, the technology, the burial ritual, and let almost none of the people who carried it into their bloodline. The team's summary became the phrase the whole topic now turns on. The Tarim mummies, they wrote, were a population genetically isolated and yet culturally cosmopolitan, a population that borrowed everything from everyone and stayed, or genetically, completely alone. There is one detail that makes them suddenly, almost unbearably human. On the heads and necks of some of the Xiaohe mummies was a smear of a pale, dried substance. In 2024, a team led by the paleogeneticist Chao Mei Fu sequenced the DNA inside it. It was cheese, kefir cheese made from cow and goat milk, about 3,600 years old. The researchers identified it as the oldest cheese ever found, and it still carried the DNA of the microbes that fermented it, a lineage of lactobacillus related to the kefir cultures people still use today. Think about what that means. 4,000 years ago, an isolated people in a desert kept a living fermentation culture alive, passing it on generation to generation, the way a sourdough starter is kept alive in a kitchen now. They were buried with it, cheese placed on the dead, for a journey. This is not a primitive isolate. It is one of the puzzles, a people sealed off by their own genome, and yet utterly fluent in the culture of a world they refuse to marry into. A 4,000-year-old corpse should not be able to threaten a government. These do, because the Tarim Basin is the homeland of the Uyghurs, and the question of who was there first is not academic there. Some Uyghur nationalists have claimed the mummies as ancestors, proof of a people in Xinjiang before Chinese rule. Chinese state narratives have pulled the other way, folding the mummies into a story of a multi-ethnic China since deep antiquity. And in the West, the same bodies have been recycled into a lost white race fantasy. The science supports none of them. The genome shows a local, isolated Bronze Age population, not European settlers, not straightforwardly Uyghur ancestors. Modern Uyghurs are a much later, mixed, Turkic-speaking people. The mummies are not a flag for anyone. The politics has a real cost. Access for foreign scientists has been restricted and exhibitions interfered with. In 2011, a major American museum show opened with the mummies held back entirely, after Chinese objections, restored only after high-level diplomatic negotiation. And one honest gap remains, separate from all of it. The genetics dismantled a migration story. It did not say what these people spoke. Tocharian really does appear later, in this exact region, and where it came from is still unknown. Later, steppe ancestry did enter the Tarim, but not in these, the first. The DNA closed one mystery. It did not close the others. For this story, the open questions are not a footnote. They are the whole point. We do not know how they did it, how a single population stayed genetically alone for 2,000 years, in the middle of one of the most traveled crossroads on Earth, with steppe migrants one basin away, while adopting those migrants' animals, crops, technology, and rituals. Cultural osmosis without a single drop of demographic mixing. No one has explained it. We do not know what they called themselves or what they spoke. The genome ruled out an origin. It cannot recover a language. We do not know why this Ice Age lineage, a ghost almost everywhere else, survived here, in the Tarim, more or less intact when it dissolved into everyone else. And we may not get to find out. The genomes we have come from a tiny number of bodies. More are in the ground, but access is restricted, and the data gap is, in part, a political one. The thing standing between us and the rest of the story is not the science. They borrowed cheese, wheat, wool, and ritual from every culture that ever passed through, and let none of them in. Strangers to the people next door, strangers to us, and in the end, strangers even to the nations that now fight over them. We still don't know how anyone stays that alone for that long in a place like that.